Hi everybody, this is Melanie Rogers with the Critical Assessment of the Precede-Proceed model for Week 8. The Precede-Proceed model is an 8-step framework in order to build an assessment of a community to diagnose a social health problem, and then to build an intervention and outcomes assessments from all of that. This is a framework of what that might look like. I think some of the strengths of the Precede-Proceed are certainly its versatility. The logic used to work through the model is broad enough. I think it can be utilized for about any behavior change at the community level with various populations that public health planners might hope to address. Stakeholder engagement is also key in this model, with you having the general public and the community affected by health problems and not just public health, medical, or academic communities having buy-in. Building evaluation into the planning phase is also a good plan, I think. Having the work done from pre-seed sets up the success of the proceed portion, and working from the end objective at the beginning of the process allows program planners to formulate evaluation points and design programs intended to meet them. Having the continuous evaluation with multiple points in time to look at the processes and impacts helps planners to see where their programs may be succeeding or failing so that they can adjust them as needed before the ultimate outcome evaluation. I think the largest weakness of Precede-Proceed is probably the resource-intensive nature of it. As laid out in the community toolbox, stakeholder engagement with community is important from the first step of using this framework, and I agree, but as someone who has worked in public health for a few years, the practical steps needed to get the public to even give their thoughts to you in a survey, let alone commit to a potentially years-long steering committee for a public health intervention, are considerable. I can see it would be very time and cost intensive just to do the social assessment, let alone any of the other steps. There is also a potential for confusion with users. I think, I've used and seen different logic models before in my work in public health, so the conceptualization of Precede-Proceed wasn't too big of a stretch for me. But if I was in my first year of working in public health and told I had to use this framework, I think that would have been pretty challenging, and I don't know that I would have been able to do that without a lot of assistance. Being able to get the community involvement also means that they need to understand Precede-Proceed, and explaining that in a way that's understandable to lay people might be challenging. With some of the lessons learned, I think things that worked well for me was working step by step on the different pieces of the framework throughout the class in order to build the final project. For me, this was evident that once I had built the SMART objectives, everything else more or less fell into place as far as defining a timeline by arranging the goals in the order I wanted them completed, and then building the evaluation plan around the goals laid out in the pre-seed section. And working backwards from the end goal in a way makes more sense to me now, having worked through this Precede-Proceed framework. I think things that didn't go well for me were overthinking it. Finding data for the pre-seed assessments could be challenging. I know that I had some trouble finding some data for the attitudinal and behavioral assessments because I couldn't find anything that was specific to the behaviors that were observed in Wilcox County. And if this was a real application of the Precede-Proceed model, I think it would probably be necessary to engage the Wilcox community residents in order to get better data for that portion. But for the purposes of this assignment, the richness of data simply wasn't there for that part of Precede. With different approaches in the future, I think after reviewing the week 7 materials about ethics and stakeholder engagement and rereading my final submission, I think I could have done a better job in this area. I think I may be slightly jaded about the process of stakeholder engagement after working in public health and seeing how difficult it is to do this in a meaningful way, so I probably didn't include as much of this as I should have in my project. But just because something's difficult doesn't mean it isn't worth doing, but I think as program planners, we may have to be creative and innovative in how we approach it. A larger portion of a budget for the intervention would probably have to go towards stakeholder activities rather than implementation in order to do this meaningfully. It might require hiring interpreters or providing childcare and meals during public forums and paying for transportation for members of the public who would be unable to attend public forums or stakeholder meetings without that type of assistance. Doing it this way would provide more meaningful community engagement, but may also require scaling back the scope of the program or decreasing the numbers served. A budget's a budget, and sometimes in public health you're likely to have one at all. I would also want to increase the sources of local data if I wanted to be faithful to the Precede-Proceed framework. So some of my budget would have to be devoted to getting this data to figure out what I need in order to have holistic assessments. Finally, I think being flexible would be best. If, as discussed in the community toolbox, it might not make sense to use every part of pre-seed proceed for a particular project. And if that's the case, I might tinker with parts of the pre-seed assessment or combine portions of the proceed evaluations in order to take on something as grand of a scale to work with it in the budget that I am provided.